Great. Hi, and welcome to How to Boss Your PR Campaign with Sarah Ross. We are going to start the presentation in a bit for you. We're just going to start off with our polls. So our first poll, how would you describe your PR knowledge and experience? So I have no PR knowledge or experience. I have a little PR knowledge, but looking to increase it. I have some PR knowledge, but would like to improve my activity. I am experienced in PR, but always looking to pick up new tips. So we've got a few people that are experienced in PR looking for some new tips. Some people with knowledge, but looking to improve their activity, which is great. Also got a few people here with no PR knowledge. Again, that's what Sarah's here for. Next poll. Which of the following best describes your previous PR activity? So I'm happy with the amount of coverage I've achieved. I haven't achieved coverage with my previous activity. I have achieved coverage previously, but I want to gain more, or non-applicable. I haven't tried yet. So we've got quite a few saying that they have achieved coverage previously, but they're looking to gain more. If you are happy with the amount of coverage they've achieved, and then quite a few people saying that they haven't tried yet. Brilliant. So our next poll, which of the following is your biggest PR issue? So I want to know how to generate more ideas for my PR activity. I want to know how to find journalist contacts. I want to know how to make my stories appealing to journalists. And I want to know how to pitch my stories to journalists. So a few coming in saying that they want to know how to generate more ideas for their PR activity. This seems to be the most popular one at the moment. Yeah. If you want to know how to pitch stories to journalists, but it mainly seems to be generating ideas. And then last one, do you understand what is meant by the term news values? No, I have never heard of the term. I have some understanding, but I would like to know more. Or yes, I am familiar with news values. So for most people understand, but they want to know more. Okay, quite a few saying that no, they've never heard of the term. Brilliant. Okay then, so I'm going to hand over to Sarah. We're going to press play on her presentation. She is going to be answering questions in the chat as well, so feel free to ask questions as we go. But great, we will see you at the end.
So today we're going to be looking at what public relations is in terms of what makes a story newsworthy, better understanding news values, how to research in terms of building your media list and researching ideas for your stories, and also how to put all of those things into practice and create your first PR campaign. So within that, we'll look at developing a newsworthy story, drafting your press release, issuing your press release, and then I've got some tips at the end on building relationships with journalists. So just a quick bit about me. So I'm Sarah, I'm the PR account manager at Anicca. I've been with the company for over 5 years now. In total, I've worked in the industry for nearly 10 years. And I've always been agency side, so I've worked on a lot of campaigns for a lot of different companies, and I've done a lot of work across B2B and B2C. So my background is in journalism. I studied at DMU, and you'll find a lot of PRs actually come from a background in journalism. It's really, really great to get some of those tips on board. In terms of delivery, I work on PR strategy, PR campaign delivery, and my role sits within the SEO team at Anicca. And that means that I also work on SEO content and link building and bring those into the PR work that I do as well. In my own time, I'm really into music, particularly punk. I believe that Doc Martens go with everything. And this year I am really missing live music and going to gigs. I've only been to one gig at the moment. So yeah, looking forward to when we get back to a bit of normality. And in terms of brands that we work with at Anicca, we've got a lot of Midlands names in there. So we've got people like Palex and Dykeman. AA labels, we've done PR work for all of those people. So let's fire away. So what is public relations? So public relations is the strategic management of communication between a company or organisation and the public. And what that means is that we're here to build and maintain a positive public image on behalf of a brand. And we do that through increasing brand awareness and using earned media to get those messages across. We're also here to defend brands and their reputations during times of crisis. And within recent years, we've also moved across to supporting SEO activities through online citations and link building. So what does that mean in terms of activities and actions? Well, there's a lot of things that fall under the umbrella of public relations, and there's a lot of different techniques that we can pull into our activity. So storytelling within press releases is probably the first one that springs to mind, and that's what we're going to go into today. But you can also look at things like case studies, which really provide a third-party endorsement of your products or your services. But we can also look at things like opinion pieces and commentary, whether your business can talk about key topics and really show yourselves as thought leaders for your industry. What public relations isn't. So there can be quite a bit of confusion on exactly what public relations can deliver and what it can't deliver. So public relations isn't free advertising and it's not advertorial. It's really important to keep in mind that publications aren't necessarily going to publish the story exactly how you've written it. This is earned media. So what we've got to do and what we'll learn how to do today is create a strong enough story that it warrants coverage on its own. Because if it doesn't, if it's too salesy or it's full of marketing language, then it's likely that the journalist will just pass that straight to their advertising team. And that's not what we want. Another thing to keep in mind is that PR isn't 100% controllable. So once we've issued a story, we can't control how that story might be printed. Whilst we might be able to come up with a really strong news hook and a really strong story, the journalist might see an alternative story to what we've created and go with that instead. Also, we can't guarantee that our story will stand alone, especially with things like roundup stories for different regions or different sectors. You'll often see certain publications or certain websites, they'll combine all of these stories together and do a sort of roundup story. So don't be surprised if that happens either. And also, it's not 100% guaranteed. So we can't promise that we will get coverage from a story, but with the tips that I'm going to give you today, it makes it much more likely that you'll see some success. And also, it's really important to keep in mind that news agendas change very quickly. And I'm sure you will have seen this yourself, like earlier this year when we all went into lockdown. The news agenda changed so fast that all of the activities we were doing for our clients, we just had to put them on hold and pivot our activity to talk about COVID, because that was the only conversation that was happening. So it's really important to keep these things in mind, especially if you are a marketing manager and you're reporting back to board members who are expecting something different out of the public relations activity. So why do we need PR? Well, again, it's really important to keep in mind that this is earned media and it's a third-party endorsement from a publication or a journalist. And research from Cision, which is a media database, found that 92% of consumers trust earned media. And when we compare that to research from Nielsen, 56% of their respondents said that they trust advertising completely or somewhat across all channels. So the difference is quite stark there. So using PR is a really good way to talk to your customers or your potential customers in a way that they trust. And how do we gain coverage for our businesses? Well, the top three things are that we need to understand what journalists are looking for, and we need to apply that to how we create a story. And then we need to present our story in a way that really appeals to journalists and makes them want to open our email for a start, but then use that story in their work. And here's some stats just to keep in mind as we go through. So 100% of journalists, when questioned by Meltwater, stipulated that their number one method of finding stories is through press releases. So learning how to write a press release and how to present it to a journalist is really, really important if you want to get some press coverage. 25% of journalists write on average 7 stories a day. That's a lot of work. So we need to do everything that we can to make their lives easier and give them the information that they want. 300 is the average number of emails a journalist receives every morning. Again, that's an awful lot of emails that a journalist is going through. So anything we can do to stand out is great. 70%, that's the percentage of journalists who spend less than 1 minute reading an email. So again, that really emphasizes how important it is in your prep work and your background work and getting your story right before you send it out there. And 45% is the increase in effectiveness for a press release with an instant news hook. And that's what we're going to look at. So what makes a story newsworthy? First, we're going to look at understanding news values. So news values are a guideline that are used by journalists and editors to help them determine the relevance of a story. And these values are applied differently depending on the type of media that you are looking at. So trade media, regional media, national media will all apply these values differently. So what they'll ask is it of interest to our audience and does it warrant coverage? Now, your news doesn't need to tick everything on the list, but the more that it does tick, the more value that that story has. And it's important to understand that some news values are more important than others. So I've listed those on the right-hand side for you, and we've got timeliness, proximity, impact, prominence, oddity, relevance, and conflict. And we're going to go into each one and just understand a little bit better about what those mean and how they're applied in real life. So timeliness. It's really obvious, but news should always offer something new, especially in today's 24-hour news cycle and world of social media. News is unfolding all the time. So journalists need something that's new or perhaps even still unfolding. And that could be, in terms of your business, that could be a new achievement. It could be hitting a business milestone. It could be welcoming new team members, creating new jobs, or creating new apprenticeships. And what I've done is just add some examples there for you from earlier this year. And these are related to coronavirus, of course, because that's been the biggest topic of the year. But what these companies have done is tap into what journalists are writing about and what they want to know about. And that's really been how a business is reacting to this situation and what are they doing to help local communities. So the examples that I've given, Northamptonshire technology businesses are working with the NHS to tackle PPE shortage. And the one at the bottom, CCM Group, taking on staff after selling 10 million masks and hand sanitizers to councils, care homes and others. So that gives you an idea of how you can tap into what's happening in the news right now. Next, we've got proximity. So this is to do with the audience and how relevant a story is to an audience. So this is really important for regional media. So we want to make sure that we're sending journalists news that is right for their patch. So we've got the example at the top there, tiny teapot found in Derbyshire garage, sells for £390,000. So that's quite a nice story for Derbyshire, but it's probably not going to work that well outside of there. As well as geographically, proximity also applies culturally. So what you'll see, if you really start to look at the media and the stories that we see, you'll notice that we're often more informed about events that happen in America and Australia than some of those closer non-English speaking countries that there are in Europe. So the example that I've given here is toilet paper panic buying strikes again as shelves are stripped of loo roll in Australia. So culturally, we're quite similar because we've had those same problems here in the UK. So it's important to keep both of those ideas in mind if you're looking at proximity. So impact really speaks for itself. It's about the number of people that are going to be affected by something. And this could be something major like job creation. Obviously, at the moment, there's also a lot of talk around job losses, but it could also be something about service closures, changes to bus routes that might affect local people, in particular vulnerable people, road closures, how is that going to affect local people? How might that affect local businesses? And business growth. How is this affecting your industry or your local community? And what impact might that have? So the examples that I've got here, Debenhams ready to cut 2,500 jobs in New Blow to High Street. So not only is that having a massive impact in terms of the jobs that are cutting, but it's also alluding to the high street where there are ongoing major issues and how that might affect the high street as well. And then we've got DIY firm Screwfix to open 40 new stores and create 400 new jobs. So some nice news there for you as well. Prominence. So this applies differently to different titles depending on who is a well-known figure. So in terms of the national press, that would be royal figures and celebrities. A really nice example recently is the Marcus Rashford story and the work that he's done in getting food vouchers available to school children who were in lockdown. And that campaign probably wouldn't have got the amount of coverage and the amount of backing that it did were it not for him being the face of it. But when we're looking at other titles like industry or trade titles, those well-known figures are more likely to be company directors and thought leaders. And that applies to people like the directors at your own firms. And in terms of the regional media, we could be looking at people like councillors, local celebrities, or community champions. Business owners is another common one. We often get people commenting on, at the moment, for example, with COVID, a lot of business owners are worried about the future and making comments about potential help that they could receive, for example. So oddity is one of my favourites. I love a funny headline. And this generally applies to news that's unusual or that's rare. And it's often quite light-hearted. In terms of broadcast media, it's usually tagged on to the end of all of the serious stuff to leave you on a positive note. And these kinds of stories perform really well on social because they're really shareable and they offer a surprise. So they get lots of comments as well. So just a few examples that I've picked out for you. Ben & Jerry's have a flavour graveyard with all of their discontinued ice creams. Police pick up a penguin from Village Street in Nottinghamshire after a farmyard escape. And pensioner wiped out village's broadband for 18 months by turning on old TV. Now, these are headlines that really make you want to find out more. And we've got relevance. Again, this can vary a lot between media titles. So in terms of regional, lifestyle, business and trade titles, quite often they'll look to the national media for inspiration, see what the big topics are, and they will drill down and look at how those topics are affecting people on a regional basis, or in terms of lifestyle, how they might be able to comment. And business and trade, whether they can make any recommendations or comments on the situation. So topics that have been quite popular in recent years, we've had the plastic-free movement. And off the back of that, we've seen a lot of lifestyle articles in terms of swaps, product swaps, those kinds of things. Fast fashion, again, a lot of lifestyle pieces on that. And then recently with lockdown, we've seen a lot of recommendations in terms of online learning, wellness and mental health discussions as well. And the examples that I've given, again, related to coronavirus. So one is lifestyle, and that's related to what's a post-lockdown wedding going to look like. And then we've also got how the luxury industry is adapting for consumers in the time of coronavirus and lockdown. So yeah, at the moment, there's a lot of commentary on that. Conflict, this, in terms of businesses, this is more likely to be in the form of a disagreement and making a story newsworthy. So for example, community groups, they could be opposing council plans. Stories that you'll often see are communities opposing the building of new homes on Greenland. That's quite a common one. But we also see stories about directors who are disagreeing with new industry legislation. So the examples that I've put here, again, September time, you often see back to school stories in the form of conflict, and that will be parents and kids who haven't followed strict uniform guidelines and the issues that causes. And then the second example is Nottingham academic hits out at government's decision to bring in 10 p.m. curfew, which seems to be quite a common conflict in different regions that's going on at the moment. So they're just two examples of how conflict can be applied. So with those in mind, we'll then get started on our research. So before we start writing anything, what we really need to do is understand our audience and understand who they are, what their interests are, what the media titles are that they're consuming, and what kinds of stories those media titles are publishing. And that will really help to give us inspiration of how we can talk about our own business and the potential stories that we can create, keeping these news values in mind. So what we need to do is also follow the news and make sure that we keep up to date on what's happening. Most of us tend to do that on a national level anyway, but it's really important if you work in a particular niche or a particular industry, it's really important to get to grips with what's happening there as well. And it means that we can relate to things like hot topics. So what are journalists covering today, and how can we make a comment on that in terms of our business? Can we use trends and talking points, and can we see how our business fits into that and what kind of commentary we can make there? And can we look to identify regional angles for stories that are unfolding nationally? What kind of comment can we make? But it's also good because we can highlight thought leadership opportunities, and we can respond to issues that could potentially affect our business or our community. So they're all really good reasons why keeping up with the news on a local, national and industry level is important. Another thing that I recommend is following the competition. So you always want to know what your competitors are up to. Personally, I do this by following social media accounts for my clients' competitors and following key hashtags for that industry as well. So if we're using Anicca Digital as an example, we'd be looking at things like hashtag digital marketing or digital PR. And I also recommend setting up Google Alerts, because this will alert you to any new coverage that your competitors are gaining in the media. But also set one up for yourself, because that means that you can also monitor the coverage that you're achieving through your own story. And the benefits of doing this are that we can get a better idea of stories that are getting traction. So if we know what our competitors are doing and how they're getting their press coverage, that can really help to inform our ideas and our media lists as well. It also helps us to keep up to date with discussions in our industry and what's happening, what's unfolding. And yeah, as I mentioned, it's really beneficial for your media list. So on the right-hand side, I've just added a little tip there about when you are adding your brand name to Google Alerts. Just make sure you're putting that in speech marks to ensure that you're only getting coverage for your actual brand name, rather than additional words that are within your brand name. So for example, if I didn't do that and I'm searching for Anicca Digital, I'm going to get everything coming in that covers the word digital, and I don't really want that. So what you might need is a bit of inspiration for developing your ideas and working out a PR calendar. So one of the things that I really recommend is story mining with your colleagues. Chat to your customer service team or chat to your department specialists. Find out what they're working on, find out what customers are asking, or what products different departments are developing, those kinds of questions. Because there might be something going on that you're not aware of that could be a really great story. Also, your own data can be a source of inspiration. So it might be that the last 6 months have been very unusual. Is there something, have you got a product or is there a service that you've seen a massive increase in demand for, while shopping behaviour and online behaviour has been unusual? So there's different ways that we can look at our data and find potential angles for stories. Also, Google Analytics. So if you have a site search box on your website, you can go into Google Analytics and have a look at that and have a look what people are actually searching for on your website. And this might give you some inspiration as well from understanding what customers actually want to know. Is there some sort of extra comment that you can make that can help with that? And there are also some tools that we can use. So Answer the Public is really useful for things like key phrase research and content marketing, but it can also be helpful for developing ideas for PR. So the example that I've given on the right there is when I put in the phrase digital marketing, and what it pulls up are the ways that people are searching and how people are searching using that phrase, along with other ideas. So these are digital marketing, just to read a couple of examples: digital marketing to increase sales, digital marketing to earn money, digital marketing, is it worth it? So looking at some of those, that might give you some inspiration of how you can develop ideas into a story for PR activity. Another one is Twitter, and it's always worth keeping an eye on the hashtag journo request. So this is used by journalists who are actively looking for things, for stories that they're working on. So that might be a comment, or it might be a product, or something along those lines. But what we can do is also use it for research purposes. So if we know what journalists are actively looking for and what they're actively working on, that can help to give us an idea of how we can tap into that and use what they're already looking for to our own benefit. Again, help a reporter out. That's quite similar to Journal Request. A lot of it tends to be US based. There is some UK stuff in there, but so what you do is you sign up to it, and then it emails you every day with what journalists are looking for. Again, I mainly use this as a tool for inspiration. So if we know what's being covered and what journalists are working on, we know how we can tap into that. I would also follow publications and journalists on social media. So if there's a particular title that you want to be in, follow that on social media, read their website, look at what they publish, and see how you can echo that. With industry and trade titles, they often have forward features list. So it's worth having a dig around on the website and having a look at that and seeing what features are coming up and how you can provide commentary on that. And on Twitter, there's some really great accounts for inspiration. So I highly recommend following Digital PR Examples and Digital PR Inspo. So these mainly cover link building campaigns, but the ideas are really, really creative, and that's a great source of inspiration in itself. So now we're going to look at building a media list. So there are some tools out there to help with this, particularly for people like me that are agency side. We really rely on tools because we're working across a lot of different campaigns for clients in different industries, but they can be really expensive. So if you're an in-house marketer and you're looking for, you're on a really limited budget and you're looking for a way that you can do this without spending any money, then there are some ways that you can start to build a media list. So the free methods that we would use are social media. Again, just like we are looking at publications and following publications and journalists to get inspiration, we also want to do that for building our media list. Media websites. So if you're looking at stories that and coverage that your competitors have earned, who is the journalist that has written those stories? Because if they're covering your competitor, it's highly likely that they would be interested in covering you as well. So find out who those people are, and quite often you will find their contact details on the website. If not, there's always a Google search, so try searching for them. You might be able to find their email address that way. Or quite often for national media, if you've got somebody's name but you can't find exact confirmation of what their email address is, give it a guess. If everybody else at that publication has an email address in the format of name.surname@title.com, then chances are that that's what their email address is going to be. So sometimes it's worth a guess as well. If you're really struggling, send the journalist a message on social media and say, I've got this story, I think you might be interested, can I send it to you? And in terms of tips on gathering all of that information, so what I do is I keep all of that information in a spreadsheet, and I keep notes on the campaign as I go along. So I do this because it helps me to keep track of when I've issued a story and when I'm following up, but also it's really beneficial for helping you to remember who are safe bets in terms of coverage and where you can get those quick wins from. So if you've got a journalist who covers a couple of your stories, the next time you have a story, you know where to go first. And I've included an example of what this looks like because I think it's quite helpful to see an example. So I would have the contact name in there and the job title, media type. I wouldn't worry too much about that, but you want your outlet name in there, you want your email address and phone number, contact details. And then I add things like the date that a story was issued. And then in my notes, I will add things like if a journalist asked for more information or if they have published a story straight away, whether they followed up, whether I got an out of office from them. And it's really useful for doing this and really useful for then weighing up what the success of your campaign has been at the end. So keeping all of that in mind, we're going to look at creating our first PR campaign and how to develop a news story. So in terms of developing a story, what we want to do is, once we've done our research, we want to start listing possible topics that we could be using for our stories. And then we want to perform some checks to see if it's worth pursuing these stories and whether we think that we can get coverage from them. So is this story going to be newsworthy outside of your company? That's a really important question to ask, because sometimes you can be so involved with the story and so enthusiastic about what your company is doing that it can be difficult to see from the outside what that story might look like. Ask yourself who will be interested, who's going to want to know about what your company is doing or what this new product is that you're offering. Look through the list of news values. Does it tick any? And how is that going to fit into wider topics in the news? And again, I will say this throughout, but reading the news, especially from those titles that you want coverage from, is really important in understanding what they publish and how you can create something that they will publish. And the particular journalists that you want to target, look at the stories that they are creating. So developing our story. If you have performed all of those checks and you're not sure, you're struggling to see whether your story has news value, whether it is newsworthy, then it probably isn't if you're struggling to see that. A couple of things that I would keep in mind that I've learned the hard way. So company anniversaries and staff anniversaries generally aren't of interest to the media because every company has them and they can't cover every single story. So that's something to keep in mind. Also, website relaunches and rebrands is one that I get asked quite a lot. And unless you're somebody like Amazon or eBay, then nobody's really going to want to know that. But what we can do if we want to shout about these things is that we can add additional information to make these stories bigger. So what we want to do is look at additional information that can add weight to a story or additional stats. And journalists really love stats. So if we can do any of those things to add more weight to the story and tick more of those news values, then that's really beneficial. So what we could do if we're talking about an anniversary story or a website relaunch story, we can tie that in with other topics. So what's your company aiming to do in the future? Have you rebranded or relaunched because you've got a set target in mind or a set direction that you're going in with your business? Job creation. Can you talk about that? How many jobs are you wanting to create? You know, something along the lines of we're aiming to double our workforce in the next 12 months. You know, that can really grab the attention of a journalist. Client wins are another one. Are there any big names that you can talk about? Again, product development, product launches, those kinds of things. Turnover targets. What was your turnover in the first year of business compared to what it is now? So if you're talking about an anniversary, you can add those stats in to really inflate that story and give it some serious weight. What are you doing to inspire the next generation? Are there any skills shortages? Are you providing apprenticeships? Are you, are you talking to colleges and schools in order to get young people interested in getting involved in your industry? And can you talk about your company history? One thing that I really love working on, and I've done this for a client a couple of times, is a rags to riches story. So I have a client with a member who he set up his business from home, from his spare bedroom. And I think it was about 5 years later, his turnover had reached £1 million. So that's a really nice story. And it's a really great business story because it shows his determination and how little he started with and how successful he is now. So things like that make really good stories as well. Alternatively, is there an oddity that you can talk about? So a really good example is from a client of mine, from a colleague of mine, sorry, and she was doing a story about a new security guard, and their background was really interesting because they were a former gladiator. So that's a really great story. But it could also be something like, if your founder switched industries to launch their firm. Like our MD, Anne Stanley, she used to work in science, and she moved into digital marketing and launched Anicca. So it's interesting backstories like that. There might be an angle there. And another thing is market research. Have you done any? Has it thrown up some unusual findings about your customers? And is there something that you can talk about? Alternatively, if there is new industry legislation or that you disagree with, you can comment on a conflict in your industry. So this might be something that you're concerned could potentially impact on jobs or on profits, or is there something that could potentially hinder business growth, recruitment, or product development? But I would say with this one, just do tread carefully and don't damage any relationships in the long term. So once we've got our ideas, what we really need to do is create a news hook. And what this is the main angle of your story. So just a reminder, some of those stats from the start, 70% of journalists spend less than 1 minute reading an email. That means they're not going to read your entire press release. So what we need to do is create a news hook and provide that in an attention-grabbing, succinct, easy to understand way that conveys all of the facts in the fastest way that we can. Because the journalist isn't going to read your entire email, your entire press release. They're going to make their decision on whether to cover that story based on probably the headline and the first sentence. So creating a news hook, how do we actually do that? So we need to be able to convey the main gist of our story in one sentence. And that sentence should tick all or most of the 6 W's. And those 6 W's are who. So name your company, or you can describe your business and what you do. So for example, I could say Anicca Digital is, or I could say the leading digital marketing agency. What? Describe what's happened, but describe it as concisely as you can. So if we're going with the leading digital marketing agency, we could then follow it with has moved to new premises, or we've taken on more staff, or we're hosting an event. Where, in terms of the regional press, I would be specific. But for national media, you could be, you could say East Midlands instead of Leicester. And then further down in your story, you can be more specific about that detail, especially in terms of regional press. You can even say what street they're based on further down. So if we're sticking with Anicca, what I would say is, so Leicester's leading digital marketing agency has moved to new premises. When? So I always recommend using the present tense to emphasize to journalists that your story is new and that it is ongoing. So rather than saying Anicca Digital moved to new premises. I'm keeping that word has in there because that gives it that present tense. Why? Try and explain why this has happened or why it's significant. So that might be because it's the first or the latest, it could be new, or it could be innovative. So if we're still talking about Anicca and our move to our new premises, we would say, something along the lines of to accommodate growth. What that would be the why of our story, and why we need to move premises. And how has your business achieved this? So again, if we're sticking with Anicca, the Anicca story, we could say we've invested in order to move to new premises. So what that sentence might look like in the end is something along the lines of Leicester's leading digital marketing agency invests in new premises in order to accommodate growth. And that should tick all of your 6 W's. So keeping that in mind, we'll then look at how we can use that to start writing our press release. And in terms of press releases, going back to those stats again from the start, it's the best way to get your story in front of the journalist. And these stats here show us why having a clear news hook is really important, because 45% of journalists say that it makes a press release more effective. So having a news hook could be the key to whether or not your story gets picked up and whether it gets coverage or not. So in terms of how we actually write that, I've split it down to give you a guide when it comes to writing your own. So starting at the top, we've got the heading, and what we want to do is keep that clear and concise and try and sum up the story as best we can. And then after that, we've got our 6 W's. So try and stick to one sentence and try and put all of that information in that sentence. That's your news hook, and it should be clear within that sentence exactly what your story is about. We can then follow that with additional detail that really colours in the story. So anything that you're not able to squeeze in the very first sentence, you can add it here. And then after that, we tend to put in quotes. So who's the most appropriate person to be commenting? Possibly a director, possibly if you're working with a customer or it's a case study, something like that, you might have other people to provide quotes as well. After that, I always recommend adding a link to your website. We're also using PR to build links back to our clients' websites. And sometimes, even if it's not a specific link building campaign, sometimes we can still earn links from doing that. So it's really beneficial. And then after that, you've got additional info or background info about your company. So I just wanted to work backwards and show you how that then applies and how you can look at news stories and start to pull them apart and better understand how they've been written and what that information is conveying. So this is a local example. Derbyshire caravan and motorhome retailer sees sales surge during coronavirus crisis. So if we break that down, it really highlights how journalists themselves use those 6 W's. So in terms of where, we're talking about Derbyshire. Who, that's the firm that we're talking about. The what, in this case, it kind of ticks 2 boxes. So they are selling new and used caravans, and they've seen a sharp increase in sales. When has that happened? During the coronavirus crisis. And why has that happened? Again, coronavirus crisis. And, we don't need to go into detail there about why people are holidaying in caravans, because, we're really familiar with those restrictions. So we understand that. But that really gives you a demonstration of how those things are applied. So some extra tips once you are writing your own press release. don't make it time sensitive. Always try and remove references to time or date where possible, because quite often, especially when you have a lot of stakeholders involved in the signing off process, that can add delays to your story and delay that being sent out. So we don't want to make your story old before it's even got to the journalist. Where possible, avoid using industry jargon. Keep in mind journalists and audiences. So how you write your press release really depends on who you're talking to. So we need to adapt language for that audience. If you are a business who are looking for regional coverage, then you really want to remove all of that jargon and talk in a way that everybody can understand, because that's the kind of audience that regional press is targeting. Whereas if you are looking for coverage in a trade title, you perhaps want to include a little bit of that jargon, because the journalist is going to be more familiar with the topic, and so is the audience. So it's really about balance, and it's really about keeping in mind who you're talking to. I would also recommend avoiding using any marketing or sales copy. So it can make it really difficult for journalists to see the news hook and understand what the story is if it is hidden around too many adjectives. So journalists want facts, they don't want fluff. So if your story sounds too salesy and has got too much of that marketing copy in there, then it's likely that they're going to send it to their sales team or their advertising team, and that's not what we want. So take a look and try and see it from a third party's point of view, and what you're trying to say with that language. And again, the best way to learn is to read the news. So when I was a journalism student, the way that I learned how to write like a journalist was reading tabloid newspapers, because they write in a really succinct way, especially in those opening sentences. So I recommend reading something like the Metro or the Daily Mirror to really get a feel for how those stories are written. So now we're going to look at issuing our press release. And what we want to do is prepare our email to issue our press release to journalists. So what we need to do that is our approved press release. We'll need a high quality image to accompany the story and to illustrate the story. I always recommend having something that illustrates the story nicely. So it could be something like a headshot of the spokesperson, or it could be, if you have some stock images, it could be something like that. Keep in mind that a journalist might want some more information. So I would plan when you're going to issue your story so that you have available time to answer their queries, should any come in. And again, make sure that either the person that's quoted in your story or somebody who can also talk knowledgeably on the topic, make sure that they're available for interview should you get any requests once you've sent that out. So then what I do, I copy and paste my press release into the body of my email. I attach the press release and the image. If you've got more than one image or you've got really large file sizes, we don't want to clutter inboxes and annoy people. So in that case, what I normally do is put those things in a Dropbox folder and then include the link within my email, because it just helps to make sure that we're not sending massive files to people. And once we've done that, what we then want to do is include a short pitch to the journalists that we're targeting. And what we want to say within this pitch is say very briefly what our story is about and why they might want to cover it, or why their audience would be interested in our story. It's also can be quite beneficial to reference other work they've done, because it demonstrates to them that you have done your research and you know the kind of topics that they cover. So on the right hand side, I've put a good example here. So this one reads, "Hi Jessica, I just read your story on the health benefits of the keto diet. I've got a good one for you. A new survey of 2,000 keto followers found that 87% of keto dieters report that they cheat on the diet. So it's highly likely that the journalist Jessica is going to be interested in that story and doing a follow-up piece to what she wrote originally." In terms of your subject line, keep it short and snappy, and make sure that you are sending it to yourself on your desktop or laptop and your mobile as well, to see how that subject line appears and that it makes sense. And digital agency Era, so they did some research about the best words to use in your subject line when you're sending out a pitch to journalists, and they found that the top 5 words were best, revealed, new, data, or study. So if your story relates to any of those things, make sure that you're putting those words in your subject line of your email. So tips for writing your email. Again, keeping in mind those stats from the start. So if a journalist is getting 300 emails every morning, we need to make sure that we are top of the pile. So personalized pitches generally get a better response. The practicalities of doing this can be difficult sometimes. If you have a big media list, you're going to want to automatically generate that. Otherwise, it's going to be really, really time consuming. I would also recommend adapting your pitch for the type of media that you're targeting. So what you might say to a journalist on a regional title is going to be different to the pitch that you put forward for a trade title. I would recommend not putting your headline or your subject line in all capitals, because we don't want to shout at journalists. And don't be afraid, once you've sent out your story, if you haven't had a response, then don't be afraid to follow up. Again, we know how many emails journalists are receiving, so it's possible that they've missed it in their email, in their inbox. It might not necessarily be that they weren't interested in covering it. And when we're following up, we shouldn't be afraid to change the subject line or our pitch. It's important to change those up and see what works best. But I would, where you're doing that, I would refer back to your spreadsheet and keep notes in there. And that will help inform your next campaign, because you can better understand what generated the most response from journalists and how you can repeat that. So they're the top tips for writing your email. And then lastly, I've just got some tips on building relationships and getting journalists on side. So some of the things that I've learned over the years are that understanding news values and better understanding the news really can help to maximize our PR activity and help us to create better campaigns. We always want to be giving journalists stories that are relevant to them and that are of high quality and that they're interested in. We don't want to be filling their inbox with stories that aren't relevant or are lacking in some way, because it makes it more difficult to earn their trust. So, we know that they're receiving hundreds of emails and hundreds of stories a day. We really need to demonstrate that ours are of of high quality, and they're always worth reading. We also need to keep in mind that journalist deadlines are always very short. So if they're looking for an extra comment, or they're looking for additional questions to be answered, the deadline that they will give you is usually going to be quite tight. So do what you can to meet them, but if you aren't going to be able to meet them, just be honest with the journalist. They might extend the deadline to you know, help both of you out. But what I wouldn't do is leave it to the last minute and then let them down, because they will see you as not a reliable source. So it is worth keeping that in mind. And I would always say, this is a difficult one, but where you can fit in around a journalist's requests, this is particularly true of broadcast. And I've had a couple of occasions where we haven't been able to deliver the interviewees that they wanted on a particular day or a particular time. And that means that they've then dropped the story, because for them, the news moves so fast that, you know, a couple of days later, when we've got somebody available, that's too late for them. So it's always worth keeping those things in mind as well. And that's why when we're sending out our press release, it's good to check with those spokespeople to check that they're still available. And I would always back up what I'm saying with facts and stats. So if you're talking about a percentage increase, for example, if you send out your story with just that percentage increase, the journalist is definitely going to ask you what those extra figures are, because they won't just rely on what you're saying about the percentage. So it's just worth keeping that in mind, that we need to provide those facts and those stats from the outset where possible. And that's it. And I hope that has been helpful for you. I hope for people that are planning on launching their first PR campaign, I hope that's been beneficial. And I hope that people who have previously tried it but want some tips, I hope there's also something there for you as well. If you want to follow me on LinkedIn, my details are there. And if you've got any burning questions, then you can catch me on email as well. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sarah. That was a great webinar. We're running quite close to time. So, Sarah, if you could just pop your email address in the chat, that'd be great. Just in case anyone wants to email. We also have Sarah's slides in the handout. So if you want to download them, just quickly, we have our usual offers. So we still have free access to the online learning platform. So feel free to go on there and get access to lots of learning tips on there as well. We also have our digital marketing training course, which actually starts in October, but there will be other course dates coming shortly. So any questions, again, have a look at that. Feel free to grab something. So yes, Sarah, if you just pop your email address in the chat box for us, Sarah. We did have a few questions, but yeah, if you could drop Sarah an email, that would be great. Next week we've got Gurpreet. She's going to be talking us through paid search, more on the basic side of it, so pay-per-click. So feel free to join us there. And thank you very much, guys, and we'll hopefully see you next week.